The planetary hub of Sirian buzzed with its usual vibrant chaos. Alien species of all shapes, colors, and textures shuffled through the enormous docking terminals and up to the towering halls of the Intergalactic Coalition's diplomatic wing. Jack Sanders stood near a panoramic window, watching the colorful throng of life move below. He was dressed in a simple but sharp diplomatic suit. Clean lines, nothing too flashy. His colleagues had told him to play it cool, follow protocol, and stick to the script, but he wasn't so sure that would work here. "Sanders," called out a voice. It was David Ross, Jack's longtime friend and now his second-in-command. He approached, carrying a sleek holographic tablet. "The Tyrillians are in the conference room. They're early." Jack smirked. "Punctuality. Classic Tyrillians. You ever work with them before?" "Only in passing. They're efficient, no nonsense. Not much for small talk, though. Guess that makes two of us." Jack gave Ross a slap on the shoulder and headed toward the conference room. The chamber was large and oval, the walls made of a translucent material that shimmered faintly with any movement. Sitting on one side of the central table were 3 Tyrillians. Jack had seen their species in files and holovids before, but it was still a shock to see them in person. Their skin was smooth and opalescent, reflecting light like pearls. Their wide, dark eyes seemed to drink in every detail, and their posture was perfectly straight. The leader of the group rose gracefully as Jack and Ross entered. She was taller than he'd expected, her movements deliberate and fluid. "Ambassador Alira," Jack said, stepping forward and offering his hand. "It's an honor to finally meet you in person." She regarded his hand briefly before clasping it in a gesture that was neither a shake nor a grip, but something in between. "Jack Sanders, I was beginning to think you would be like every other human I've encountered so far, predictable. Give me a chance to prove you wrong," Jack replied lightly, taking his seat across from her. Ross exchanged a quick glance with Jack, silently asking if he wanted the second-in-command to join the discussion. Jack nodded. Ross took a seat to his left, his tablet ready to jot down any important points. Jack had learned long ago to trust Ross's judgment. He was sharp, steady, and always ready with a solution. Alira introduced her 2 advisors, Taina and Voller, and they exchanged a round of formalities. But when the small talk ended and the business began, Jack noticed something that didn't fit the stereotype of the rigid Tyrillian approach. Alira's questions weren't just about trade routes or the parameters of the pending agreement. They were layered, curious, almost philosophical. "And how does your species maintain consistency between generations?" she asked at one point, leaning forward slightly. "Your historical records suggest periods of fluctuation." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Fluctuation's one word for it. Let's just say we've had our ups and downs. But that's what makes us, what's the word, resilient?" "Resilient," Alira repeated, almost tasting the word. She then turned to Ross. "What about you? How would you describe the human approach to adversity?" Ross looked to Jack, who nodded, inviting him to answer. "We try to find new angles. A setback isn't the end of the line. It's a chance to get creative. Sometimes that creativity gets us out of trouble. Other times it just makes things interesting." Jack chuckled at the understatement, and to his surprise, Alira's mouth curved into something that might have been a smile. "Interesting. Perhaps that's what you'll bring to this delegation." The conversation turned to logistics, but Jack noticed a change in the room's energy. The initial stiffness was gone, replaced by a more open, fluid exchange of ideas. Alira's advisors began asking their own questions, and Ross chimed in with suggestions that seemed to genuinely intrigue the Tyrillians. Jack let the dialogue flow naturally, guiding when necessary but allowing the Tyrillians to set the pace. By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere was more collaborative than he'd expected. As they stood to leave, Alira approached Jack directly. "I'll admit, I expected this meeting to follow the same predictable patterns as all the others. You've surprised me." Jack tilted his head. "In a good way, I hope." Alira gave him that almost smile again. "Time will tell." When they left the conference room, Jack turned to Ross. "How'd we do?" Ross grinned. "Well, they didn't storm out or file a complaint. I'd call that a win. High praise, Jack said, laughing. He glanced back over his shoulder, catching a glimpse of Alira before the doors closed. There was something different about her, a curiosity, a subtle shift in the way she viewed him. Jack didn't know what it meant yet, but he was interested to find out. Chapter 2. Unfamiliar Ground. Jack rubbed his temples as he scanned the layout of the negotiation simulation on his tablet. The sleek conference room aboard the diplomatic vessel felt more like a classroom today, with hollow projectors lighting up the walls and assistants rushing in and out. Across the table, Ross raised an eyebrow. "You sure this is going to work?" Ross asked. "It has to," Jack replied. "If we're going to understand their approach, we need them to see things from our perspective." That's easier said than done. They've been handling these situations their way for centuries. Ross leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "Why not just stick to their framework?" Jack shook his head. "Because their framework doesn't account for improvisation. It's rigid. They need to see what happens when things don't go according to plan." He glanced toward the door. "Where's Alira?" "Probably triple-checking every detail," Ross said with a smirk. "She doesn't strike me as the go-with-the-flow type." Moments later, the door slid open, and Alira entered with her two advisors, Taina and Voller. They were as poised as ever, their movements so smooth they seemed rehearsed. Jack stood, gesturing for them to take their seats. "Ambassador Alira," he said warmly, "thank you for joining us." She inclined her head. "You mentioned a unique approach to this discussion. I'm curious to see what you've prepared." Jack grinned. "I think you'll find it enlightening. The simulation is designed to mimic the kind of unexpected scenarios we've faced in human diplomacy. Instead of following a strict sequence, you'll need to adapt on the fly." Alira raised an eyebrow. "Adapt?" "I was under the impression that humans prized consistency in their procedures." Ross chuckled. "You'd be surprised how often we have to throw the rulebook out the airlock." Taina and Voller exchanged skeptical glances, but Alira kept her gaze on Jack. "Very well. Let's proceed." As the simulation began, holographic projections surrounded the table, displaying a fictional interstellar trade dispute. Jack watched as the Tyrillians navigated the first few steps with their usual precision, calculated offers, logical counterarguments, and carefully measured concessions. But then the scenario shifted. A new variable was introduced. A third party unexpectedly entered the negotiations, threatening to disrupt the delicate balance. Alira frowned, her fingers twitching as she considered her next move. "This is highly irregular." "Welcome to our world," Ross said, leaning forward. "What would you do if this actually happened in a live negotiation?" Alira hesitated, her calm demeanor cracking slightly. "We would reassess the situation and develop a new strategy." Jack nodded. "Exactly. And how long would that take?" She pursed her lips. "It would depend on the complexity of the new factors. And by the time you finish reassessing, the entire deal could collapse," Jack said, his tone more conversational than confrontational. "That's why we emphasize quick thinking and adaptability. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts." Alira's gaze narrowed. "Instincts can lead to hasty decisions and unnecessary risks." "True," Ross agreed. "But instincts can also save you when you don't have time to overanalyze. That's the point of this exercise, not to follow a script, but to learn how to think on your feet." As the simulation continued, Alira and her advisors started to experiment with different approaches. They made uncharacteristically bold moves, testing the waters with offers that would have been considered too aggressive in a traditional Tyrillian negotiation. Each step brought a mix of success and failure, and with each failure, Alira grew visibly frustrated. After the final scenario concluded, Jack switched off the holographic displays and leaned back in his chair. "So, what did you think?" Alira folded her hands, her expression contemplative. "It was challenging. I see the value in practicing under less predictable conditions. However, I'm not convinced that such chaos is necessary." "It's not about inviting chaos," Jack said. "It's about knowing how to handle it when it inevitably comes." If you can do that, you'll be prepared for just about anything. Tana spoke up for the first time. It's an interesting approach. Perhaps we could benefit from more exercises like this. Alira nodded slowly. Perhaps. As they left the conference room, Ross nudged Jack. You think we got through to her? Jack smiled. I think we gave her something to think about. That's all we can do for now. Chapter 3, Ripples in the Water. Jack leaned back in his office chair, spinning a stylus between his fingers. The window behind him framed the glistening spires of Syrian's capital, reflecting the endless motion of ships streaking through the atmosphere. A small notification pinged on his desk console. Ross entered before Jack could check it, a tablet tucked under his arm. You're making waves, he said with a dry chuckle. And I don't mean the good kind. Should I be worried? Jack asked, sitting up. Depends, Ross replied, tossing the tablet onto the desk. Rumors spreading that you and Alira are closer than expected. Some folks think it's compromising the negotiation process. Jack frowned. We've been having productive discussions. That's all. Yeah, well, that's not what the others see. Her people think you're trying to charm her into agreeing with everything you want. Our people think you're losing objectivity. Jack sighed and leaned forward. They just don't understand. We're not breaking any protocols. Doesn't matter if we're following the rules. What matters is perception. Ross pulled a chair closer and sat down. Look, I get it. You're trying to build trust. But the higher-ups on both sides don't see it that way. Then how do we fix this? Jack asked, frustration creeping into his voice. I can't just stop talking to her. Maybe we lean into it instead, Ross suggested. Show everyone that this isn't about manipulation or personal gain. Turn it into something they can support. Jack tilted his head. Like a cultural exchange. Exactly, Ross said, snapping his fingers. Set up a few joint events, host some discussions on shared challenges, even compare human and Tyrillian problem-solving methods. Make it all above board. Sounds like a lot of work, Jack muttered. Not as much work as dealing with the fallout if we do nothing. Jack sighed again. Fine. Get a proposal drafted. I'll pitch it to Alira. Later that day, Jack sat across from Alira in a quiet meeting room, the translucent walls shimmering faintly with movement outside. She studied him with that calm, analytical gaze he'd come to recognize. A joint initiative? She asked. Think of it as a series of workshops, Jack explained. We focus on areas where humans and Tyrillians have different approaches. Diplomacy, trade negotiations, even cultural traditions. By showing our teams how the other side thinks, we can build understanding and trust. Alira's brow furrowed. You believe this will dispel the rumors? It won't stop people from talking, Jack admitted, but it'll give them something else to focus on. They'll see that this isn't about you and me personally. It's about improving cooperation between our peoples. She nodded slowly. It's an interesting idea. I'll discuss it with my advisors. I was hoping you'd say that, Jack said, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. If we're going to change perceptions, we have to start somewhere. As they spoke, Ross entered carrying a data pad. Sorry to interrupt, but we've got a draft agenda for the workshops. Alira glanced at the pad as Ross handed it to her. Your team works quickly. We aim to please, Ross replied with a smirk. And we figured you'd have some adjustments in mind. She skimmed the list, her expression neutral. This is a reasonable starting point. Some of these topics are more contentious than others. True, Jack agreed. But if we avoid the difficult conversations, we'll never make progress. Alira looked up at him, her dark eyes steady. You believe these workshops will succeed? I believe they'll help, Jack said. It's a step in the right direction. Better than sitting back and letting the rumors grow. She set the data pad down. Very well. I'll present this to my delegation. Jack extended a hand across the table. After a brief hesitation, Alira shook it, her grip firm but not aggressive. It was a gesture of agreement, a small but significant sign that they were both willing to face the challenges ahead together. Chapter 4, The Gala Incident. The annual Coalition Gala was a spectacle unlike any other in the galaxy. Luminescent chandeliers hung like floating jellyfish, casting an otherworldly glow over the grand ballroom. Delegates and diplomats from dozens of civilizations mingled among a kaleidoscope of alien flora arranged in towering crystalline vases. Jack Sanders adjusted the lapel of his suit and took a deep breath. He spotted Ross near the buffet, already deep in conversation with a multi-armed Iloran dignitary. "Enjoying yourself, Ross?" Jack called out as he approached. "Trying to, but this guy's explaining the molecular composition of Iloran spiced wine in excruciating detail." Ross grinned and waved Jack over. "By the way, have you seen Alira?" "Not yet," Jack said, scanning the crowd. "She's probably caught up with her delegation." Ross chuckled. "Or she's avoiding you." "More likely avoiding the whole event," Jack replied. "She doesn't strike me as the party type." As if summoned by their words, Alira entered the ballroom. She wore a flowing Tyrillian gown that shimmered with hues of silver and lavender, and her usually restrained demeanor seemed slightly more relaxed tonight. Jack hesitated for a moment, then made his way over to her. "Ambassador Alira," he greeted. "I didn't expect you to come." She inclined her head. "I could say the same of you, Jack Sanders. You don't seem the type to attend lavish celebrations." "True," Jack admitted, "but it's part of the job. Besides, I wanted to see if this event could live up to the hype." Alira tilted her head slightly, a hint of a smile playing at her lips. "And what's your assessment so far?" "Jury's still out," Jack said, gesturing to the dance floor. "But maybe I'll be convinced if you join me for a dance." Her brow furrowed. "Tyrillians do not partake in such displays." "Really?" Jack asked, arching an eyebrow. "Not even once, just to try it out?" "It's not our custom," she said, though there was a flicker of hesitation in her voice. "We have no tradition for what you call dancing." Jack glanced back at Ross, who was now chatting with another group, and then leaned slightly closer to Alira. "What if you didn't think of it as a tradition? Just a moment to enjoy yourself. No strings attached." Alira studied him for a long moment before finally saying, "I suppose there is no harm in one dance." Jack extended a hand, and Alira accepted it with her usual composed grace. They stepped onto the dance floor, drawing a few surprised glances from both humans and Tyrillians nearby. The music swelled, a slow, melodic tune, and Jack led her in a simple, measured sway. "This is peculiar," Alira remarked, her voice quiet enough that only Jack could hear. "In a good way?" he asked, a faint smile on his lips. "It is not unpleasant," she said after a pause. "Merely unfamiliar." Jack chuckled softly. "Well, that's a start." As they moved, he noticed the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. Her movements became more fluid, less hesitant. Jack kept his steps gentle, mindful of the unfamiliar territory they were both navigating. He caught Ross giving him a knowing grin from across the room, and Jack fought the urge to roll his eyes. "This is not what I expected," Alira said quietly. "Neither did I," Jack admitted. "But sometimes you just have to go with the flow." Their dance ended, and the music shifted to a livelier tune. Jack led Alira off the floor, noticing the subtle shift in the crowd's energy. The Tyrillians seemed more curious than disapproving, and the humans looked intrigued rather than judgmental. "Well," Jack said, "what did you think?" "I think it was an interesting experience," Alira said, her calm exterior intact, though there was a slight warmth in her tone. "Perhaps not as rigidly structured as our own cultural practices, but not without its merits." "Glad to hear it," Jack said, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "Maybe next time, I'll teach you a few human dance steps." Alira raised an eyebrow. "I will reserve judgment on that until the time comes." Jack chuckled. "Fair enough." As they made their way back to their respective delegations, he couldn't help but feel that, in some small way, they had taken another step toward mutual understanding, one dance at a time. Chapter 5: Close Encounters. The light from Sirian's twin moons filtered through the large windows of the observation deck. Jack leaned against the railing, watching the alien sky shift with soft hues of lavender and gold. The tranquil atmosphere was a welcome break from the usual bustle of diplomatic meetings. Ross stood next to him, cradling a cup of steaming tea. "You sure this isn't some ploy to get her to agree with us?" Ross asked, smirking. Jack shook his head. "You give me too much credit. Sometimes it's just nice to get away from the conference rooms." Ross nodded and took a sip. "So you've got no hidden agenda tonight?" "Not this time," Jack said, flashing a grin. "What about you? You didn't just wander up here to enjoy the view." Ross sighed, setting the tea down on a nearby ledge. "I'm keeping an eye on you. Everyone is. They think you're getting a little too friendly with the Tyrillians." "Is that so?" Jack asked, folding his arms. "I thought we were all about building trust and understanding." "Sure, but some people think you're crossing a line," Ross said. "You're going to get yourself tangled in something messy if you're not careful." Jack considered that for a moment. "I appreciate the concern, but I think you're reading too much into it." Before Ross could reply, the soft hiss of the door behind them drew their attention. Jack turned and saw Alira entering, her smooth, opalescent skin catching the moonlight just so. She paused when she noticed the two of them, then walked over with that same measured grace. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Alira said, her voice calm. "Not at all," Jack replied. "Just enjoying the view." Ross glanced at Jack, then back at Alira. "Well, wanted to see this view for myself." Jack nodded. "It's something, isn't it?" She was silent for a moment, then said, "You're different, Jack Sanders." "I'll take that as a compliment," he said lightly. "You should," she replied, a faint smile on her lips. "You do not approach negotiations the way I expected. Your methods are unconventional." "Well," Jack said, resting his elbows on the railing, "if you do everything the same way every time, you stop seeing the possibilities. I like to mix things up, keep people on their toes." Alira tilted her head. "It's not just your approach. It's you. I've never met a human quite like you." Jack glanced at her, surprised by the remark. "In a good way, I hope." "Perhaps," she said, her tone thoughtful. "It's intriguing." Jack let the silence linger for a moment. Then he asked, "Why did you really come up here?" She looked out at the moons. "I wanted to speak with you, without advisors or colleagues. Just us." Jack turned to face her more fully. "What's on your mind?" Alira hesitated before saying, "This is unfamiliar territory for me. I have always relied on structure, on protocols. Yet when I'm with you, those rules seem less important." "Maybe that's not a bad thing," Jack said softly. "Sometimes stepping out of our comfort zones shows us what we're really capable of." She met his gaze, her dark eyes studying him closely. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," he admitted. "But it's worth it." Alira moved a fraction closer, and Jack found himself drawn in by the slight shift in her expression. A mix of curiosity and something else, something unspoken. The air between them seemed to thrum with unacknowledged tension. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter. "Do humans often form connections like this?" "Connections like what?" Jack asked, though he had a feeling he knew what she meant. "Between diplomats. Between people from such different backgrounds." Jack considered his words carefully. "It's not common, but it happens. And when it does, it can change the way we see each other. It can change a lot of things." Alira's gaze lingered on him, then she stepped closer still, her hand brushing against his arm. The touch was brief but deliberate, a silent test of boundaries. Jack didn't pull away. Instead, he reached up, his fingers lightly grazing her hand, meeting her halfway. "You're not like anyone I've met either," Jack said quietly. Alira's lips curved ever so slightly. "I find that intriguing as well." As their hands remained lightly connected, the moons above bathed the deck in pale light, making the moment feel both fragile and enduring. Neither of them spoke again, but they didn't need to. In that quiet, shared stillness, the barriers that had seemed so formidable not long ago began to feel just a little thinner. Chapter 6. Cultural Crossfire. Jack sat on the edge of his desk, a cup of strong Syrian blend coffee warming his hands. The overhead lights of the coalition's diplomatic wing buzzed softly, their steady hum fading into the background of his thoughts. Across from him, Ross leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a skeptical frown etched across his face. "So let me get this straight," Ross said. "You want to stand in front of both delegations and talk about emotions?" "Not just emotions," Jack replied. "Understanding, perspective, how we approach challenges differently but can still find common ground." Ross shook his head slowly. "You realize they're going to eat you alive for that, right? Neither side is exactly known for embracing heartfelt speeches." Jack smirked. "You make it sound like I'm walking into a gladiator pit." "Not far off," Ross muttered, taking a sip from his own mug. "Just be careful how you frame it. Last thing we need is for them to think we're trying to manipulate them." Jack set his cup down and rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm not looking to manipulate anyone. I just want to keep this thing moving forward. If they can see that our differences don't have to be barriers, maybe we can actually get somewhere." Ross shrugged. "All I'm saying is, don't expect a standing ovation. They're diplomats, not poets." Before Jack could respond, a soft chime sounded, announcing a visitor. Jack glanced at the door just as it slid open, revealing Alira. She stepped in with her usual calm composure, though her gaze flicked briefly between Jack and Ross, as if gauging the atmosphere. "Am I interrupting?" she asked, her voice measured. "Not at all," Jack said, standing. "We were just going over some ideas for tomorrow's session." Alira nodded and stepped closer, her hands clasped in front of her. "There is a matter I wanted to discuss before the meeting." Ross glanced at Jack, then rose from his chair. "I'll give you two some privacy." As Ross left, Jack gestured for Alira to take a seat, but she shook her head. "This won't take long," she said. "I've noticed that some members of both our delegations are uneasy with the direction our discussions have taken." Jack folded his arms. "Uneasy how?" "They fear that we are losing focus on the practical objectives in favor of more abstract concepts. Concepts such as mutual understanding and cultural empathy." Jack frowned. "And you? I think that focusing on those concepts is vital," Alira said, her dark eyes meeting his. "But I am also aware of the pressure to demonstrate tangible progress. Our colleagues need to see results, not just dialogue." Jack nodded slowly. "So we need something concrete, something that shows we're not just talking in circles." "Precisely," Alira said. "I suggest we present a joint proposal, something that highlights a specific, achievable goal." Jack leaned against the desk again, thinking, "Okay, what if we take one of the sticking points, like the trade route restrictions, and develop a pilot program? Something small but impactful, to prove we can cooperate." Alira considered this. A pilot program could be effective. If it succeeds, it may help shift the perception of our discussions. "Exactly," Jack said. "We show them that cultural understanding isn't just talk. It's a foundation for practical solutions." Alira nodded. "I believe that could work. I'll have my advisors draft some preliminary parameters. If you do the same, we can review them together before the meeting." "Sounds good," Jack said. He hesitated for a moment, then added, "Alira, I know this isn't easy for you. Breaking with tradition, stepping outside the usual approach. It's a lot." She looked at him, her expression unreadable at first. Then, very faintly, her lips curved into a small smile. "It is, but it is also necessary. Sometimes, progress requires stepping into the unfamiliar." Jack smiled back. "I couldn't agree more." As she turned to leave, he stopped her. "Oh, one more thing. Thanks for sticking with this." She glanced back at him, her expression softening slightly. "And thank you for helping me see that sometimes it's worth the effort." Jack watched her go, the faint sense of shared purpose lingering in the room. He sat back on the desk, picked up his cup of coffee, and took a long sip. He knew Ross would have a sarcastic comment ready as soon as he returned, but Jack didn't mind. For the first time in days, he felt like they were actually getting somewhere. Chapter 7: The Unity Project. The large hall was alive with the chatter of diplomats, officials, and their aides. Jack stood off to one side, quietly going over his notes. Across the room, Ross adjusted a holoprojector, ensuring that the presentation would run smoothly. They had been planning this for weeks, and it was finally time to unveil their joint initiative, the Unity Project. "This thing better be as good as you think it is," Ross said, straightening his jacket and stepping up beside Jack. "Relax," Jack replied. "We've got a solid plan, the Tyrillians are on board, and this is exactly the kind of visible progress everyone's been demanding." Ross raised an eyebrow. "That doesn't mean they'll like it." "Maybe not," Jack admitted. "But we're not here to win a popularity contest. We're here to show them that we can actually get things done." A chime sounded, and the room began to quiet. Jack glanced toward the entrance as Alira and her advisors entered. She moved with her usual graceful confidence, her expression calm but focused. When her eyes met his, she offered a slight nod, and he returned the gesture. "She looks like she's ready to deliver a eulogy," Ross muttered under his breath. "Not helpful," Jack replied. "Let's just see how it plays out." As the delegates settled into their seats, Jack stepped forward to the central podium. The holoprojector behind him hummed to life, displaying a series of charts and images detailing the project's goals. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jack began, his voice carrying across the room. "Over the past few months, we've all worked tirelessly to find common ground between our cultures. But talk can only take us so far. What we need now is action. Real, measurable steps that demonstrate the power of collaboration." He paused, scanning the audience. "That's why we're proposing the Unity Project, a joint initiative to address one of the most pressing issues facing our worlds, trade bottlenecks in the Outer Rings. By pooling our resources and expertise, humans and Tyrillians will establish a pilot program designed to streamline transport, increase efficiency, and reduce delays." The holoprojector shifted to display a detailed map of the Outer Rings, highlighting the proposed routes and logistical hubs. "This isn't just a theoretical exercise," Jack continued. "It's a practical solution that will benefit both our species. And if it succeeds, it could serve as a model for future cooperation on larger issues." As he finished, Jack stepped back, allowing Alira to take the podium. She offered a brief nod of acknowledgement before addressing the room. "The Unity Project is not merely a plan," Alira said, her voice steady and clear. "It is a statement that despite our differences, we can come together to solve complex challenges. By engaging in this initiative, we demonstrate our willingness to trust, to learn, and to grow alongside one another." The room was silent for a moment after she spoke. Then a low murmur began to spread as the delegates whispered among themselves. Jack exchanged a glance with Ross, who gave a slight shrug. "Now comes the fun part," Ross muttered. The questioning session was, as Jack had anticipated, intense. Several delegates raised concerns about resource allocation, potential risks, and political ramifications. Jack answered each question as clearly and honestly as he could, while Alira's calm, analytical responses helped to defuse the more heated objections. Throughout it all, Jack and Alira worked as a team, their contrasting styles complementing each other. Jack's approachable, human warmth balanced Alira's measured, thoughtful approach. By the end of the session, the tone in the room had shifted. The murmurs were no longer filled with doubt but with cautious interest. As the meeting adjourned, Jack leaned against the podium, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Ross walked up and clapped him on the shoulder. "Not bad, Jack. Not bad at all." "I'll take that as a compliment," Jack said, grinning. Alira approached them, her expression unreadable at first. "You handled their questions well," she said. "It seems they are more receptive than I had anticipated." "Thanks," Jack replied. "I think it helped that you made a strong case for the project's benefits." She gave a small nod. "We will still have to address their concerns in greater detail, but this is a promising start." "Agreed," Jack said. He glanced at Ross, then back at Alira. "Why don't we schedule a follow-up meeting to refine the details? If we keep the momentum going, we might just pull this off." Alira met his gaze, her dark eyes steady. Very well. I will coordinate with my advisors and let you know when we are ready to proceed. Jack smiled. Sounds like a plan. As Alira turned to leave, Ross leaned in. So, what do you think, Jack? Are we actually pulling this off? Jack watched as the Tyrillian delegation exited the hall, then turned to Ross with a small, confident smile. I think we're finally getting somewhere. Chapter 8 Beyond Predictability. The grand auditorium on Syrian was filled with delegates, dignitaries, and members of the press. At the center of the stage, Jack stood behind the podium, flipping through the last pages of his notes. Ross was seated at a side table, triple-checking that the presentation slides were queued up and ready. They had reached the final phase of the Unity project, presenting their results. Jack glanced toward the rows of Tyrillians and caught sight of Alira. She sat with her advisors, her calm demeanor unchanged. Their eyes met briefly, and she gave him a slight nod. Jack took a deep breath. It was time. Ross leaned closer and whispered, "Ready to blow them away?" "I hope so," Jack muttered, straightening his shoulders. He stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jack began, his voice clear and steady. "When we started this project, many of you had doubts. Could two species with such different approaches to problem-solving truly work together? Could we find solutions that benefited us both? Today, we have the answers." He gestured toward the large screen, where Ross displayed a series of visuals. Transport routes that had been streamlined, cargo delivery times that had dropped significantly, and resource efficiency charts that clearly showed the benefits of cooperation. The numbers told a compelling story. Jack continued, "By pooling our knowledge and adapting to each other's strengths, we didn't just solve a logistical issue. We proved that collaboration can lead to outcomes neither side could achieve alone. And while these results are just the beginning, they set the stage for something even greater. A future where our species can continue to learn from each other." Applause broke out across the auditorium. It wasn't thunderous. These were dignitaries, after all, but it was genuine. Jack allowed himself a small smile before stepping back from the podium. Alira was next. She rose gracefully, her opalescent skin reflecting the lights of the stage. Her measured steps carried her to the podium, where she paused to survey the audience. Then she spoke. "What we have accomplished through the Unity project is more than a simple improvement of trade routes," Alira said, her voice calm and deliberate. "It is a demonstration of what becomes possible when we set aside preconceptions and approach challenges with open minds. I was skeptical at first, as many of you were, but what I have learned, what we have all learned, is that our differences are not weaknesses. They are opportunities." Jack watched as Alira delivered her speech, her composed tone resonating in the vast hall. She detailed how the collaboration had allowed Tyrillians to consider new approaches, ones they would not have explored alone. She also acknowledged the challenges, openly admitting that there had been conflicts, missteps, and moments of doubt. Yet in the end, those struggles had led to growth. When Alira finished, the applause was louder, more sustained. She stepped down and returned to her seat, where her advisors offered quiet words of approval. Jack felt a weight lift off his shoulders. They had done it. Together, they had turned a daunting challenge into a shared success. Ross sidled up to him, grinning. "I told you it'd work." "You told me I'd get eaten alive," Jack replied, his grin matching Ross's. "Details," Ross said, waving a hand. "Seriously, though, that was a hell of a presentation. You and Alira really sold it." Jack looked toward Alira, who was engaged in conversation with a few other delegates. "She's come a long way. We both have." Ross raised an eyebrow. "You're not just talking about the project, are you?" Jack hesitated, then shrugged. "Let's just say I've learned more than I expected." Ross gave him a knowing smile but said nothing further. Instead, he clapped Jack on the shoulder. "Enjoy the moment. You earned it." As the audience began to mingle, Jack walked over to Alira's side of the room. She saw him approach and turned to greet him. "You spoke well," he said. "You really brought it home." "And you laid the groundwork," she replied. "It was a team effort." They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, watching the delegates discuss the results of the Unity project. Jack glanced at her, a thought lingering in the back of his mind. "You know," he began, "when we started this, I wasn't sure what to expect. I thought I had you figured out. Thought I knew exactly how this would play out." Alira raised an eyebrow. "And now I know better," Jack said, smiling. "You're full of surprises." Alira tilted her head slightly, her expression softening. "Perhaps I've learned the same about you." The words hung between them, unspoken but understood. Jack nodded once, a subtle acknowledgement of the connection they had built. Not just as colleagues, but as two people who had managed to bridge a gap that once seemed insurmountable. As the room buzzed with the hum of conversation and the occasional clinking of glasses, Jack felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. They had come a long way, and while the road ahead was still uncertain, he knew they had made a start. One step at a time,